Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch, and I'm actually not at Blossom and Branch. In case you're wondering why it doesn't look like I'm at the farm, it's because I'm not at the farm. We are so deep in our construction project right now that it is completely unlivable. So we are here for probably the next couple of months, seed starting here, and I'm doing it all in the basement. So these were all grown here in the basement using only fluorescent shop lights. I don't use fancy grow lights. We're going to be doing a video here this week on my indoor seed starting setup, but for now, I wanted to show the results of our trials. Guys, I was really surprised to see the results of this experiment. I kind of had an idea where it was going to end up. What I really like about the test that I did is that I feel like it gives lots of different options. So in case you need to modify, the information that we learned from doing these trials, I think is really helpful. So let's launch into it. We're gonna first start by going back to when I started this experiment and how I set it up and all the soil mixes that I made. Let's go over to past Bree in the greenhouse. Today it is cold. It is also a little bit echoey because we're in the greenhouse. If you watched our seed starting videos before, you know that I love soil blocking. It's literally just making these little cubes of soil and starting our seeds directly in here. Now the reason that I like it is because it makes for stronger seedlings, healthier seedlings, and it doesn't require plastic. We're always looking for the more sustainable options. So we did some experimenting last year using wool pellets in seed starting, but we wanted to do it again this year using less because the wool pellets can be cost prohibitive. They can be expensive. If you don't have sheep like we do that you can get pellets from, you have to buy them, and that can be costly, obviously. So what we wanted to do is experiment with different ratios. So we're doing a few different experiments. We've also gone a little bit further with all these experiments to see what effect mycorrhizae and cinnamon has, to find out, does any of this really matter? Maybe just using the potting soil is going to be the best one, in which case, great. That's a lot easier for all of us, right? Mycorrhizae is, just to talk about what mycorrhizae is, it forms associations with the roots of the plant. So think of it as something that maybe takes a little bit of a nibble from a plant root, and as it does that, it forms an association with that plant root, and that it serves as an extension of the plant root. So while the mycorrhiza is getting benefits from the root exudates, the sugars and things coming out of the roots of the plant, it's feeding off of those. It is also serving as an extension of the root system of the plant itself. So it's helping extend the root system and gather more nutrients and more water for the plant. So having mycorrhizal associations is really good for our plants. So I'm going to be experimenting with different ratios when it comes to these ingredients. I also have my trusty soil blocker. I'm going to be using my 5 soil blocker, which is the medium size. Today I'm going to be using a pint-sized mason jar. So this is going to be my part. So when I start mixing together soils and coconut coir, I'll be calling it a part, and that'll just be a pint-sized mason jar. Depending on what scale you're seed starting at home, you might use a bigger jar, you might use a smaller one, but a part is a part is a part, no matter what size container you're using. This is just a scraper. And then of course trays. These are fiberglass trays. They are made in the US, so I always love using anything that's US made. They're also very sturdy. If you want to learn more about this technique, we have full videos on soil blocking. But you can kind of get the idea from here. You might be wondering, is it worth it to do all of this work in seed starting? And if you're questioning me on that, I don't blame you. It does seem like a lot to do all of this when you could just go to the store and buy seed starting mix and stick it in a tray and be done. But when it comes to our theories and our strategies and our efforts on regenerative gardening, this is where putting in this effort here up front helps a lot down the road in the garden, because the healthier our plants are when we plant them out, the less we have to do in terms of fertilizing, in terms of pest management, all of those things we have to do less. So the healthier the plant is from the get-go, the less we have to do and invest in the garden. So this is why we put so much effort into seed starting, because I really find that the healthier our plants are when we plant them out, the better off they do the whole season. So for me, yes, it is worth it. It might not be for you, and that's okay. Maybe you're just gonna, let me do this experiment, and then once I figure out which one works the best, just use that, that's fine. But it can be fun to do your own experiments too. Trying different soils and seeing what does best in your climate. So here it is. It has been about 6 weeks since we started those trials. Now, I will tell you that the first 2 weeks, I was thinking that this is going to go differently. The ones that actually ended up doing the best initially actually looked much worse than the others. But after about 4 weeks, these ones that ended up doing the best far surpassed the other ones in growth. So let's talk about what I think happened and all of our results. Let me move this one over so you can see what this one is. I had a lot of comments last spring as you were all seed starting using our soil blocking recipes that it was hard to find green sand. So our recipes used to include green sand, which is a mineral deposit. Many people were having trouble sourcing this, and that affected the recipe. So while you can definitely still use our recipe from last year, that one will still work really well for you. If you've used it in the past, continue to use that if you've had good luck with it. This was for those of us who experimented with the wool pellets, including myself. I loved using the wool pellets, but I found they are expensive, so I wanted to experiment a little bit with adjusting the quantity of the wool pellets. And I wanted to see if that really did make a difference or not. This time I did full trays of each mix. In fact, I did 2 trays of each mix. So again, just to reiterate what we did, one of these mixes has cinnamon. All these trays in the back included Mycorrhizae. So we actually did 2 trays of each. So we had a much better experiment outcome in terms of looking at what the overall pattern was of plant health here. Now, we kept a fan on all of these. We also rotated them frequently. So every other day I rotated all the trays around to ensure none were getting more light than the other or more air circulation. We kind of kept rotating things just to account for that. I started radish and I started zinnia. And remember, if you're not soil blocking, you can still use this recipe if you start in trays. Of course, I encourage soil blocking. I love it. I think it's so much better for the environment. It's so much better for your plants. Go back and watch our soil blocking videos to see me rant on about that. I just think it's a better way to start seeds. But if you need to seed start in a container, if that's what you're comfortable with, if you have containers, you want to use them up, whatever it is, go ahead and you can still use this mix in your containers as well. Now, the potting soil that we are using here is still the Fox Farms Coco Loco, and I'm going to explain why we use that and also give you an alternative. So the reason why we use Fox Farms Coco Loco is because it's peat-free. So it doesn't contain the peat. Peat harvest is just environmentally very unsustainable. It releases a lot of carbon during its harvest. It decimates the ecosystems of the peat bogs, and peat bogs are one of our biggest carbon sinks on the planet. So we really want to maintain those vital ecosystems to help sequester as much carbon from the atmosphere. This is the same idea behind regenerative agriculture and cover cropping and keeping living roots in the soil. It's because it sequesters carbon. So the same thing with peat bogs. Peat bogs sequester carbon. They keep it down in the peat itself, but as soon as we start harvesting that, it releases into the atmosphere. So that's why we go with a peat-free potting soil. We've tried a couple different ones. I recommend Fox Farms Coco Loco. I'm not sponsored by them. They don't advertise with me. This is not promotional at all because I've tried a few different ones. I've tried Beyond Peat, which did not, from bag to bag, was very inconsistent for me. We have tried experimenting with using our own compost. The problem with using compost is that a lot of people don't have access to it. So many people don't have a compost pile. I think it's great to have a compost pile, but a lot of people just don't. And I don't want anyone to not be able to do this because they don't have a compost pile. If you have a compost pile, feel free to experiment with it on your own. But because the composition of every compost is different, especially homemade compost, all store-bought composts are different. Is it mushroom compost? Is it sheep compost? Is it manure-based compost? Is it leaf-based compost? There's just so many different composts out there on the market. That's why I don't use them as a base for these recipes. It's because I found that the Coco Loco is just the most consistent. If you can't find Coco Loco, First of all, check a hydroponic store and check your garden store. If they carry Fox Farms products, ask them if they'll carry Coco Loco. If you tell them that you're gonna buy it, they probably will. But it's one of the only peat-free soil mixes out there that we've been able to find that is widely available throughout the US. So that's why we're using the Coco Loco. So I'm gonna go ahead now that I've talked about that, we're gonna go through each of these in turn. These two trays were the ones that I would consider to be the winners, the most successful seeds, the trays that look the healthiest overall. And there's a couple things that I look at when I am analyzing for plant health. Obviously, how much growth they have, how big they are, whether they have any disease issues, any fungal issues, general vigor, size of the stem. So looking at all of those things, these two trays were by far the winners. And these are the only trays that don't have leaves that are yellowing. And I find that really interesting because almost all of the other ones have leaves that are in some stage of yellowing. Yellowing in seedlings can happen for a couple of different reasons. Sometimes it will happen because they're overwatered. Sometimes it can happen because there's too much nitrogen. Sometimes it can happen because typically it's because they don't have enough nitrogen, but can happen for a variety of reasons. The ones with the wool pellets were the only ones that didn't have any yellowing leaves. So this recipe here is the 3 parts of Coco Loco and a 1/2 part wool pellets that we ran through the food processor. Now, I know that most of you are gonna think that I'm crazy for running wool pellets in my food processor. I promise you, I washed it afterwards. It didn't smell or anything afterward. If it does, just put some vinegar in it. I just pulsed them up in the food processor, which kind of lightened them and fluffed them up. And that went a lot further. So I did that before I measured it. So here I use that pint-sized mason jar. So I did 3 pints of Coco Loco here and 1 part of wool pellets pulsed. And you can still see there's still some kind of wool pellets here. But this one, again, in terms of stem size, in terms of stem thickness, health of the seedling, vigor of the seedling, these ones, hands down, for me, are the winners. Now, I did an experiment, of course. Now, we also did the experiment using cinnamon versus using mycorrhiza in the mix. And I have to say that I think it's pretty much a toss-up. The ones actually with the cinnamon did a little bit better, but that's not consistent across the board. I'm gonna go through the rest of these and then I'll talk about where I think the cinnamon versus the mycorrhiza really comes into play. The reason I tested cinnamon is because cinnamon is often recommended as an antifungal. So I wanted to try it specifically with zinnias because zinnias grown indoors, started indoors, are especially prone to funguses. They just don't tend to like being started inside. So I wanted to see if the cinnamon would help the zinnias with that. So the next one here that did the next best was these 2 trays. And these ones just had a slight modification. So these were 3 parts Coco Loco, 1 part coconut coir, and a 1/2 part wool pellets. We diluted down the amount of wool. And we'll see that these looks pretty similar to the next one, which had a little bit less wool. So here you can see they're looking pretty good. This is the one that had cinnamon. These are the ones that had mycorrhiza. Now, I think that the ones here that had the mycorrhiza look a little bit better, which I find interesting. So the ones here with the cinnamon versus the ones with the mycorrhiza, I think the ones here with the mycorrhiza do look better. And I have a suspicion that it's because as the nutrient value of the soil blocking mix goes down, the mycorrhiza is more helpful and important. So what might be happening is that mycorrhiza is actually helping these plants to uptake the nutrients a little bit better, especially considering that there's not as many available in the soil as these ones where there's a lot from the wool. Moving down to this mix, we lessened the amount of wool in this mix. So this one, the ratio is 3 parts Coco Loco to 1 part coconut coir and 1/4 part of wool pellets. So about half the wool pellets that these 2 had. And you can see, I mean, they still look fine. They don't look as good, you know, if we compare them to those ones, they don't look as good, but they do still look pretty good. I would say just a slight difference between these 2. Now, to me, this is a good sign because what it's telling us is that if you want to use the wool pellets, it is still helpful to use them even if you have to dial down how much you're using because again, they can be a little bit costly if you're buying those wool pellets. So it's okay if you have to cut the amount, you'll still get a benefit, just not as much as these ones where we used the 3 parts Coco Loco to a 1/2 part wool pellet. Down here on this end, we have basically what were kind of the controls. So here we have the 3 parts Coco Loco with 1 part coconut coir, this one and this one. 3 parts Coco Loco and 1 part coconut coir. So what you can see here is what I was starting to say about the mycorrhiza differences. Look at the difference in height of these seedlings and in vigor of these seedlings. These ones are much denser. This was the one with the mycorrhiza. This one had cinnamon. So I think what I would say is that as you are not adding those wool pellets to the recipe, it becomes more important to supplement with a mycorrhizal product. Down here toward the end, we have the straight control. This is just Coco Loco, and you'll see this again, what we talked about with the mycorrhiza. So here we have just Coco Loco in a soil block. No coconut coir, no wool pellets. Here we have the one that had mycorrhiza. Here we have the one that had cinnamon. So as you can see, the ones with the mycorrhiza, definitely bigger, fuller, stronger, healthier than the ones that just had the cinnamon. So really interesting on that front. So again, just to reaffirm, I think what's happened here when we're talking about using the cinnamon in the mix versus the mycorrhiza supplement in the mix was that the less nutrients the soil mix has, the more important it becomes to have that mycorrhiza included. Once we started really decreasing or eliminating the amount of wool pellets with having coconut coir in there, that's where we started to see issues in yellowing of leaves, weaker growth, and also in this one that was just Coco Loco and no additional mycorrhiza. So what I would say is if you're not going to use the wool pellets, then I would plan on using additional fertilizers. We have our homemade stinging nettle seed starting fertilizer video. You can use that one. You could use highly diluted fish fertilizer, 1 teaspoon per gallon. And if you can, spring for that additional mycorrhiza to add in. But I think what happened was when we started adding the coconut coir, that carbon from the coconut coir is kind of tying up some of the nitrogen in the seed starting soil. So by adding that, I think that if you're not going to also add some wool pellets or some mycorrhiza, I don't think there's any point in doing it. And just a reminder that I did not fertilize any of these as we went. There was no fish fertilizer. I didn't add anything, but I think if we had, it would have helped. These ones down here, they didn't have that additional nitrogen source from the wool. It made perfectly good blocks when it was just the Coco Loco. When it was the Coco Loco with the wool pellets, they all made fine blocks. So if you need to simplify it, the good news is here that you can still get, I mean, the difference between this one and say, well, let's use this one. So of course, now this one is the one with wool pellets in it, you know, so if we compare, really adding that mycorrhiza almost balanced out all of these differences, where you can see the differences more intensely with the ones that use just the cinnamon. These ones here in front, these ones looking really, really good. Down here, these ones looking not so good. These are the ones that just had cinnamon and no additional mycorrhiza. Again, this one has the 1/2 part wool pellet. Here we just have just straight Coco Loco. And then up here, there's definitely more consistency, I find, in the mix that contained the mycorrhiza. So this is the part that I actually was not expecting, because I did not personally think that the ones that had mycorrhiza were going to do better. Sorry, Dr. Earth, it's nothing against you guys. This is also, I'm not sponsored by them at all. I think there's just a lack of evidence right now in terms of what supplementing mycorrhiza can do, because we're not exactly sure what kinds affect which plants. We're just not that far along in the science of it yet. But we do know, for example, let's talk about inoculants. So when we're talking about planting our cover crop, we talked about this when we planted our pea cover crop last spring, and we talked about that you have to add that inoculant, that rhizobia, to the seed in order to get the nitrogen fixation benefits of the cover crop. That's an interaction between the seed, the plant, and the fungi in the soil, the mycorrhiza, the rhizobia, that's an interaction between those peas and that rhizobia in the soil. So we know that it can really have an effect using the correct rhizobia on the correct seed. So this is where I think using something, if you're going to use a mycorrhiza in your seed starting soil as an amendment, I think using something that has a broad spectrum of different mycorrhiza is the way to go. Because again, if you're starting a whole bunch of different kinds of seeds, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of mycorrhiza, so just get one that has the most different types of mycorrhiza in it possible, and then just add it to your soil. Now, if you can't find Coco Loco, so I got this question a lot last year, if you can't find Coco Loco, I honestly have been able to soil block with any mix that I've tried, any potting soil that I've tried. Now, the exception to this is peat-based. The other reason, in addition to the sustainability factor, that I don't like to use peat in soil blocking mixes is that peat, you might have noticed this, say you've bought Miracle-Gro potting soil, which is really heavily peat-based. When you have it and it's dry and you try to wet it, you know how hard it is to wet. It floats, it goes up, the water goes to the bottom, the soil floats to the top. It's a nightmare to wet the first time. This is the reason that I don't like to use it for soil blocking, because if your soil blocks dry out, and once they're at this maturity, you should be letting your seedlings start to dry out in between waterings. Once they dry out, re-wetting peat-based soil blocks can be really difficult because they float. So you water them and we bottom water and they'll just float up to the surface. It's very annoying, I don't like it. So if you can't find Coco Loco, say you're in a different country or you just can't find it anywhere, you can't source it, find the highest quality peat-free potting soil that you can and sift it like we sift all of our potting soil mixes. Sift it through a 1/4 inch sifter. We have one linked in our Amazon storefront below. Sift it through there and then you can use it in any of these recipes. And if you do that, please let me know how it goes, because I'm always trying to gather information on which ones work well and which ones don't, so that I can share that with others. My updated version, I am going to go with either just use straight Coco Loco with mycorrhiza or use the 3-part Coco Loco, 1/2 part wool. All right, guys, I think this was a successful test and trial, and it was worth starting seeds before Christmas for me to do this. Stay tuned for our next video. We'll be showing you exactly how we set up our seed starting area. It's really not complicated, which lights we use, and all of that good stuff. In the meantime, if you have any questions about this test, please feel free to let me know, and let me know your thoughts down below. See you guys around here next time.